Look at them all on their own merits. It's hard to imagine how you wouldn't decide that the way things are done in Svelte is the way it really should be. I think it simplifies so many things, and so we'll see if you agree with that after you see a bit of the code here. And so what is it? It's a way of building web apps that you could look at as an alternative to doing it with React or Vue or Angular. And one thing that makes it unique is that it's a compiler. So it's taking your Svelte code and compiling it down to JavaScript. It's not a runtime library. It is generating exactly what is needed to run your app at runtime. It is itself implemented in TypeScript. And so what you do is you create these .svelte files for each of your components, and then all that gets compiled down to this one JavaScript file for your app. There are no runtime dependencies. So when you look at the package JSON that it gives you to start with, it's all going to be dev dependencies because it's compiling everything down. It does not use a virtual DOM. And in the end, when I give you a list of resources, there's a talk that was given by Rich Harris, the guy that created Svelte, and he explains in great detail why he thinks using a virtual DOM is not really a good thing and is an issue for performance. So Rich Harris used to work at the Guardian newspaper, and now he's at the New York Times. And while he was at the Guardian, he created a web framework called Reactive, and it's still used at the Guardian today, and there are other companies that use it. But using what he learned from building that, he created Svelte and made a number of improvements. There are things from Reactive that ended up inspiring some parts of the Vue framework. Rich Harris is known for other things as well. He created the roll-up module bundler, so he's a pretty prolific guy. And for that reason, Svelte uses roll-up by default, but you could also make it use Webpack or Parcel if you would prefer that. So I really like to see the code as soon as possible when I'm looking at a new technology, and so I want to do that for you today. You're all experienced web developers, and so you'd probably like to see what this code looks like compared to the framework that you're using today. And so let's look at the classic To-Do app. And if you've seen any other of my talks this weekend, you've seen something really similar to this already. So I've got a URL where you can go check out all the code, and it even has a unit test and end-to-end test implemented. So my basic To-Do app tells me how many to-dos I have, and of those, how many I still need to complete. And then if I check a bunch of them and then click Archive Completed, it's going to archive them. I'm not really saving them anywhere. In this simple version, I just get rid of them. Then I can type in the text for a new to-do and click the Add button or just hit the Enter key, and it will be added. And so what you see outlined in red there is my to-do component, and then the whole thing is the to-do list component. So each to-do has three things in it. There's a checkbox, there's the text of the to-do, and then there's a button for deleting it. And if you click the checkbox, it draws a line through it and changes the text to be gray, just to indicate that that is done. So to start off, we have this main.js file, and toward the end I'll tell you how to begin building a new Svelte app yourself, and so you'll be given this file already, and then you can just tweak it to say, this is the component that really represents my whole app. You import that in, you create an instance of it, and you say where it should be rendered. And you won't be doing this, creating an instance directly in that way with any of your other components. It's just the topmost one, and so I'm telling it, render that to the body of my document and make that my default export. So that's all you have to do to kick it off. So first we'll look at the to-do component and then the to-do list component. So Svelte components have three parts to them, and this is very similar to Vue, just the order of the sections are moved around. So I've got a script section, a style section, and then in Vue you would have a template, but I don't need to wrap it in a template here. It's just any HTML I want. And in fact, the first two sections are optional, so I could have a component that's just rendering some static HTML, and the whole Svelte file would be just a chunk of HTML at the bottom. So at the top, I do my imports, and in this example, I want this component to dispatch events that the parent component to-do list can listen for. Not every component is going to need that, but because I'm using that, I have to create an instance of the event dispatcher. And then that export line there is very special. Because Svelte is a compiler, it means it can interpret what is in this file however it chooses. And one of the choices they've made is to say that's how it will indicate what things are props for this component. So when I see an export, it's telling me anybody who wants to use this can pass in the to-do as a prop. And it's a let because it can have its value changed. My styling here, there's nothing really special going on except for I want it to be that if you click a to-do, toggle its checkbox, I want to change the text to be gray and draw a line through it. And you see that down here, that the span that displays the text of the to-do is going to have a class of either done-true or done-false. And when it's true, I get that styling. So on to the HTML. Remember I said a to-do has three things. I have an input, which is a checkbox. I've got this span that shows me the text of the to-do. And these curly braces are doing interpolation. And I can put any JavaScript expression there, and whatever its value is, that's what it will render. And then I've got my button, says delete, and if you click it, I want to dispatch a delete event. Back up here, if you change the state of the checkbox, I'm going to dispatch a toggle done event. And should it be checked right now? That's determined by this Boolean. So essentially what we're saying is that the to-do component itself doesn't know what to do when you toggle the state, and it doesn't know what to do when you delete one, but it can send that event up to its parent. Hopefully that knows what to do. So here's the to-do list component, and we're going to look at the three parts of it. So first, the script. And so I'm importing my to-do component. I want to have a way of creating new to-dos, and each one has a unique ID. And so last ID starts at 0, and I have this function for creating a new one. You tell me the text of the component. Optionally, you can tell me if it's already done. And then I create this object where I bump up the ID by 1. It's got the text. It's got the done. Then just a bunch of variables. But there's something really special going on here, and that is the way you define the state of a component in Svelte is you just define top-level variables. And those are the state. And what I mean by that is if I make changes to any of those variables, this component is going to re-render automatically. So I don't need to do special things to say it's the state or make it re-render. It just happens. And so the state of my to-do app is the text for a brand new one that you're going to type in. And then I have an array of to-dos. And I'm choosing for this to start with already having 2 of them. I want to learn Svelte. That one's already done. And then I want to build a Svelte app that's not already done. Then the next 2 lines both start with a $sign and a colon. That's called a reactive declaration, and we'll talk about this a bit more later. Remember earlier I said that Svelte, being a compiler, can interpret this any way it chooses, and it chooses to say, if I see a label, that's what that really is, just a JavaScript label, and its name is $sign, I'm going to treat that like a reactive declaration. And what that means is that if any of the variables referenced in that line change, it's going to execute that again. So if the value of my to-dos array changes, I'm going to look through that and find, I'm going to build an array of all the ones that are not done, and then get the length and set this variable uncompleted count. And that'll just recompute anytime to-dos changes. Likewise, the status, that's the part at the top of the UI where it said like 1 of 2 remaining. I want to build that string here. And so I get the uncompleted count that I set right there. I can get the number of to-dos. And so anytime either of those changes, it's going to rerun this line and give me a new value for status. Then I have a bunch of functions that I'm going to use for my event handling. And note that they are just plain JavaScript functions. They're not methods that belong to a class or methods on some literal object the way that they are in Vue. Just plain functions. So if I want to add a to-do, well, I know that I will already have the text for the new to-do in to-do text. So that's right here. I have my function to create a new to-do. I concatenate that onto my to-dos array. And it's important that I'm concatenating it because in order for Svelte to realize that I've made a change to something that's part of the state, I've got to actually change the whole array. And so that's what I'm doing there. I'll talk more about that in just a bit. And then once I've added it, I like to clear out that input where you type in the text. And so just set it to an empty string. So anything that changes the state is going to cause the HTML that we're going to see in just a bit to re-render. If I want to archive the ones that are completed, well, I just filter out the ones that are, I keep the ones that are not done and make that my new array of to-dos. If I want to delete a single one, then I want to filter out and keep only the ones that are not the one I'm trying to delete and assign that back. And to toggle the state of one, because I've clicked the checkbox, I can get the ID of the one I want to toggle. And then I use map, and I'm checking to see, is this the one you want to toggle? If it is, I want everything that was in the to-do object except for I want to flip its done state. But if it wasn't the one you want to toggle, just keep the same to-do. So that's my basic event handling. And then here's the CSS for that. And I didn't mention this earlier, but the style tag that you specify in a component is automatically scoped to that component. In Vue, you have to tell it that by adding scoped, but it just automatically happens here. The only thing special here is that my unordered list that holds all of my to-dos, which are list items, I don't want to have bullets in front of them, and so I've got some CSS to turn off the bullets. And then the HTML that is the whole app here, I've got a heading at the top. I'm displaying my status there. That tells me how many are remaining to complete. I have a button that you can click to archive. It just calls the archive completed function. Then I have a form where you can type in a brand new to-do. And so that's got an input in it. And I'm binding to to-do text. So that gives me a two-way data binding. It's going to display whatever that value is right now. And if the user changes it, it will update that value, which is in the state of my component. My add button is disabled if you don't have any to-do text. And as soon as you type something, now you can click that. And when you click it, I call add to-do. Then down here, I want to loop through all of the to-dos. And I do that with this # each. And I give it here something that is iterable, like an array. And then what do I want to call each element as I'm iterating through them? So this is mustache style syntax. Maybe it looks odd to you if you've been used to using the other frameworks. And I'll talk more about why this perhaps is a good idea in just a bit. So I'm looping through all of them, and I want to create a to-do component for each one. And here's where I'm passing the prop. Okay? And here's where I'm setting up event listening. I'm saying, if this thing dispatches a delete event, then this is what I want to do. I want to delete the to-do that has that ID. And if I get a toggle done event, then I want to call toggle done and pass it the whole to-do object. Okay, so for me, there's a lot to like here. Kind of automatic state management. If a variable is a top-level thing in my component, that's a part of my state. Changes to it cause my component to re-render. So let's talk a bit more about that markup. Specifically the # each that you saw. So all the frameworks have a different way of handling this sort of thing. In React, you use JSX and put just JavaScript code in there, like mapping over elements in an array. In Angular and Vue, you have special attributes that you use, or directives. So we've got ngIf and ngFor in Angular. We've got vIf and v4 in Vue. But in Svelte, you use this a mustache style syntax, like an if statement and an each for iterating. And one of the benefits of this is that what you're rendering can be multiple elements. And when you're back in Angular and Vue, to use those, they have to be on a certain element, which means that's going to be a parent of all the things that you're rendering. You're kind of forced to have this common parent for the things. But with the mustache style, I could have any number of elements inside the if, and I don't have to invent a parent just to hold those things. Another way of looking at this, though, is what would it be like if you could use the Angular and Vue approach in JavaScript, like to call a function? Well, this is what it would look like. I might have this function do something, and I pass it 2 arguments, but then I want to specify at the end, well, really, I don't always want to call this. It looks like I'm calling it, but I want to tell you, don't call it unless the arg1 is greater than 10. It's kind of like using an ngf or a vf. And then I might go further and say, I don't actually want to call this once. I want to loop through a bunch of times. And so I've got this collection, and use that to set the value of arg1 and call it a bunch of times. This looks really weird, right? You wouldn't want to do this in JavaScript. And so my claim is that these are doing exactly the same thing in HTML. And this is really more like the JavaScript way of handling conditional logic and iteration. So just a little bit more detail on that. An if statement looks like that. My condition can be any JavaScript expression, and that will evaluate to a Boolean. If I want, I can have an else if. So notice the pound sign on the if. That's the beginning of one of these kinds of blocks. And then if there are things in the middle, they all start with a colon. I could have a colon else as well. And then to end it, you have a slash and an if. I think that that's a bit jarring the first time you see it, but it becomes sort of a natural thing. And as it turns out, there's not a lot of cases like this. There's the if, there's the each, and there's a thing for dealing with promises that we'll see in just a bit. And so here's a more full example. If the color is yellow, I want to output nice color. If it's orange, that's okay too. If it's anything else, questionable choice. So that's how you use that. For iterating through a collection, we saw one example of this, but here's just a bit more detail. So I can use this for iterating through any kind of iterable, an array being the most common example of that. I can also have an else that tells me what to render if there's nothing in the collection. So that's interesting. And then I end it with slash each. So here, I've got a collection of colors. I want to iterate through them, and I want to refer to each one as the name color. And here I'm using that for my style attribute and also outputting its name. And so I'll get output like this. I also can get the index as I'm iterating through them. And so here I'm adding 1 so that when I display it, it doesn't start with 0. And I'm outputting a paren and then the name of the color. And in the last example, I'm iterating through all of the keys and values in an object. And I can use destructuring there. So here I've got people. I said that wrong. I'm iterating through an array of people, and I get people objects, and I want to pull out their name and age, and then I can use them. And if there was nothing in that array, it would output that instead. The support for promises is really cool. You can call # await and give it some expression that will give you back a promise. And then you want to be able to tell it 3 things. What should I render before I get the result? What should I render when it resolves? And what should I render if it rejects? And so I can tell it all 3 of those things. And so in this example, it's going to output waiting for data. And then when it finally resolves, it'll go to the then. And I get that result, and I can do whatever I want with it. And if it rejects, I'll get that result, and I can handle the error. So really, this is a bit like React Suspense that you might have learned about yesterday. What it's not giving you is a way of saying don't display a spinner until a certain amount of time has gone by. But you do have the part of saying what to do before it resolves and then handling success and error separately. You also can omit that block that tells it what to render before it resolves. And so that's what I'm doing here. I don't have that waiting for data part. And if I wanted, I could omit the catch part. Probably not a good idea. You should probably handle errors that might occur. So that's really all the special mustache-like syntax that you have to learn. So the rest of my talk is mostly trying to zero in on what I think are the top features in Svelte, and these are the features. So the thing you hear about most is the small bundle sizes that Svelte produces, and so I'll get into more detail on that. I like that components are very file-based. I have a single Svelte file that tells me everything about that component. My CSS is scoped by default. I don't have to do something special. It just happens. There's a very clear place to put global CSS that would affect the whole app. State management inside a component is really easy. That's something referred to as reactivity. State management across my components, I use stores, and so we'll see how that works. If I want to pass data from a component down to some descendant, and I don't want to have to use props to go through a whole bunch of layers, I can use context to pass that data. We saw examples of reactive declarations. That's where I have a label named $sign with a colon after it. Two-way data bindings so that I could tie a form element to some piece of state and they stay in sync. Very easy to add animations to my UI. We'll see an example of that. And then I get runtime warnings for accessibility issues. And an example of that would be if I have an image tag and I forgot to give it an alt attribute, it'll tell me about that in the DevTools console. So let's talk about the small bundle sizes. So what's happening here is that because Svelte is a compiler, it's able to just keep whatever code it needs to actually run the app and let everything else go. Plus, Rollup is really good at doing the tree shaking thing, and so that's helping this. So if I create a production build by saying npm run build, I get this bundle JavaScript file. And so this website that I have up there, they did an investigation into this, and they built a non-trivial app and checked to see what was the resulting bundle size in all of these frameworks. And you see that the results are quite significant. Svelte is so much smaller than the others. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that your app is going to run faster, although the fact that it doesn't use a virtual DOM does help it to run pretty fast. But the main thing that you're getting here is the startup time for the app, just because there's so little that has to be downloaded. Now, some people say that Svelte disappears. And so does it disappear? Well, not quite. So what is happening here is that there's a Svelte library defined in some JavaScript files down in that directory when you're using it. And I have a little bit of detail on some of the files you might care to look at. But it is picking out the bits from those files that you need for your app and just including that part of the code. So when I get my bundled.js file, that's going to be really small. And I looked at my to-do app and wrote the same app in React and compared them. And then I checked the code that was generated to see what of that was my code and what parts belonged to Svelte. And it's about 500 lines of code that are really like the Svelte framework that it put into the bundle for me. So that is really small compared to all of the other frameworks. I like that it's file-based. So in Angular, you define a component with a JavaScript class. In React, you can do that too, but usually you use a function these days, especially with hooks. In Vue, you define a component with an object literal that tells it about the props and the computed props and the data and the methods and all that. It's all on this object literal. But you don't have any kind of a JavaScript container for a Svelte component. It's just a .svelte source file that's got a script section, a style section, and a bunch of HTML. So there's like no container other than the source file itself acting as the container. There's a couple of rules for how you have to name things. And one thing you'll notice is that you can't know the name of a Svelte component by looking at its source code. Hopefully the name of the source file gives you a good idea of what you ought to call it. But when you want to use that component inside another one and you import it, that's when you give it a name. So that makes it so you never have to worry about name conflicts between your components, because in a sense, no component actually has a name. You pick the name you want to use for referring to it when you import it. You do have to use a name that starts with an uppercase letter, because lowercase names are reserved for HTML and SVG elements. I really like that the CSS is scoped by default. I have trouble thinking of a case where I wouldn't want it to be that way. So I want to have a single place for putting CSS that should affect the whole app, and then every component have their specific CSS scoped to just that. And the way that it scopes it is similar to what you've seen in other frameworks. It generates a hash that represents that component, and then it comes up with the name Svelte dash and that hash, and it adds that as an attribute to all the elements that it renders. And then in the CSS that it generates, it makes sure that those rules that you defined only apply to elements that have Svelte dash and the matching hash. There is a Svelte 3 ESLint plugin that is related to CSS in that it tells you if you've defined any CSS rules that you're not actually using. And so that's really cool because it's easy to, over time as you're editing a component, to forget that you're no longer using some of it, and then you can get rid of the unused parts. I really like that when I'm thinking about the state of a component, it's automatically just the top level variables. And what I mean by top level is if I define functions inside my component, their variables are not part of my state. It's just the ones defined at the top level of the component. And so here's another really simple example of a component that has a piece of state called count that I start at 0. I have a plain JavaScript function increment that bumps up the count by 1. And so I don't have any styling here, but then down in the HTML part, I tell it I want to render the count, and I've got a button, and when you click it, I call increment, and that's it. So imagine doing this in the other frameworks. They won't need a lot of code to do this, but probably need at least double what you're seeing up here to set up the state for that component. Let count, that's just automatically state. So to make a change to a bit of state, you do have to give it a new value. And when it's a primitive, it's really simple like that. But when it's an array, you have to think about this and make sure that you're letting Svelte know that you've made a change. So we saw an example like this earlier. If I concatenate a value onto my array and then assign the result into here, I've really created a brand new array. And I could do a similar thing with the spread operator and create a new array where I've added a new one to the end. And another kind of tricky thing you could do is you can use push as long as you do this next, assign the same thing into itself. And this is like a mind twister. What is going on there? And the only thing I can imagine is, again, because Svelte is a compiler, it must be looking for that sort of thing and picking up that you want to change it. I really like state management in Svelte so that I can share data across components. And so you do that with stores. And so this is an alternative to having a component pass data to another one using props, or to do it using context, which we'll talk about next. So the next thing to think about is where do you want to define these stores? And it really depends on whether this is a store that should be available to all of your components, or should it only be available to a subset. If you want it to be available to everything, then a kind of a convention here is to write the file stores.js and define them in there. You can export all of them, and then any component that wants a store can just import it from there. But if you wanted to restrict it so only descendants of your component can get to it, that component can create the store and it can pass it to others using either props or context. Again, we'll talk about context a bit more later. So you have control over who gets to see these stores. There are three kinds of stores. You can have a store that is writable, meaning components that access it, they get to change values in it. And when they do, other components using the store will see that change and re-render. I can have readable stores where the store is responsible for computing its own data. It doesn't mean it won't change. It just means that the components that use it can't change it. That store itself is responsible for updates to itself. And then derived, where I want to make a store that is based on what is in other stores and computes values from there. Well, let's focus on the writable kind. I think this is the most common kind that you'll see used. So in my first example, I'm pulling in Writable from the Svelte/store package, and then I'm going to create an instance of that, and I give it the initial value. So this is a store that's going to hold a collection of dogs, where maybe each dog is described by an object. And so it's starting out as an empty array. Another thing that I could do that is more complicated, I give it the initial value like I did there with the empty array, but I also pass it a function, a set function. And so this is going to be called the first time somebody subscribes to this store. So it's kind of a lazy thing. I don't want to populate it if nobody uses it. But as soon as somebody does, it's going to call this. Now, it doesn't have to be async, but in this example, I want to show that I could use the fetch API to call a REST service and get some data back and get the JSON version of that. And then I'm passed a set function, and I just call set and give it the data I got back from the REST service. And so now any other component that is subscribed to this store will get notified that there's new data, and they can use that. If I needed to do some sort of cleanup, I can return a function, and this is going to be called as soon as the number of subscribers drops down to 0. I don't need anything like that for just making a REST call, but if you need cleanup, there's an easy way to do that. Now, how do you make use of this store? Well, all I have to do is subscribe, but there are two ways to do it, the hard way and the easy way. You never want to do it the hard way, but I'll show you how it works. Here, I am importing my dog store that I've created, and I have this bit of state to hold my array of dogs, but it doesn't have anything yet. And then I tell the dog store, I'd like to subscribe to you, and if anything changes, will you please call this function, pass me the current value, and I'm going to take that and put it in dogs, which is this bit of state. And because I changed my state, my component's going to re-render, and I can show you those dogs. I also want to use this lifecycle function on destroy and say, I would like to unsubscribe from this store if I am removed from the DOM. And now I can use dogs inside my HTML. So it's not a ton of work, but it's way more than what you see here. If you do it this way and just pull it in, as long as you refer to your store with $dogstore, the first time you do that, it will automatically subscribe you. And when this component is removed from the DOM, it'll automatically unsubscribe. And so it's just really easy. If you're okay with putting a $sign in front of it, that's the easy way to go. It's really easy to pass data from a component down to its descendants. Of course, I could pass it with a prop and a prop and a prop and just go all the way down. But this way, I'm making it so that any descendant can ask for a piece of data, and it's going to look up through the DOM hierarchy and try to find an ancestor that set this bit of context. So I can pull in the functions getContext and setContext from the Svelte package. And then in an ancestor, if I want to set some data, I call setContext, and I can give a name to this bit of data and then give it the value. And then down in a descendant, I call getContext, and I say, I'm looking for data with this name. And so it just looks upward until it finds it, and then gives me back the value. So the keys can be any kind of value. You might think that using a string would be the best thing, but you do then have to make sure that no other part of your app accidentally uses the same string, at least if it's in the same hierarchy. So the key can be any kind of value, and of course the value can be anything you want, including functions and objects that you might want to share. But remember that context is not reactive. And what I mean by this is that if the ancestor that set that bit of context makes a change to that data, everybody who asked for that is not going to be notified that it changed, and so they won't re-render. So if you want that, that just means you should be using a store instead of context, because that is reactive. So here's a quick example of using context. I've got a component A, and you see that it uses the component B. And here's my component B, and it uses the component C. And here's my component C. So in A, I'm pulling in the setContext function, and I'm setting a bit of context called favorites. And it's an object that has the color, a color yellow, and a number 19. So I don't even mention that inside B because it doesn't need that data. But over in C, I want it. So I pull in the getContext function, and I call it, and I say, can you look up above you and see if you can find something called favorites? And I get back the object and destructure it, and then I can display those values. And so I get the output that you see up there. So really easy to make data in an ancestor component available to any of the descendants. A little bit more on reactive declarations. So we said that a reactive declaration is just one that starts with a $sign and a colon, and that's just a JavaScript label. Apparently, it's not an error to have the same label more than one time in a JavaScript file. I don't understand why it's not an error, but I guess it's good for Svelte that it's not. because you might want to use that in multiple places inside your component. So in this example, I'm saying that if the value of total or count changes, I'd like to recompute the value of average. The next line is an interesting thing. Just for debugging purposes, you might want to say you'd like to print out in the DevTools console the value of count anytime it changes. So I get that just by putting $: in front of it, because that says if the value of anything in this line changes, it should rerun that line. So a really easy way to get watch functionality. You can even put that label in front of a block of code, and if any of the variables used in that block change, it'll re-execute the block of code. You could put it in front of an if statement. And so if my condition changes, it can rerun that whole if block. Two-way data bindings are really cool. So it's making it so that I can get the current value of a thing and render it, but if the user changes it, it will update that variable for me, which would typically be a piece of state in that component. And so in this example, we've got this UI that you see up at the top. So there's an input so you can type in a name, a checkbox so that you can say whether you're happy, a bunch of checkboxes to say what flavors you like, seasons, and you have to pick one of those seasons because they're radio buttons. I've got a drop down to pick a favorite color, a text area for typing in your life story, and then I'm going to report on what you did there. So I'm trying to show examples of all the common form elements and how you would bind to them. So I start with my script here, and I've got all my data, the colors I want to support, the flavors, the seasons, and then my favorites all start out being empty. I'll start out being happy. I don't have a name yet or a story. And so we want to look at some form elements that will bind to these so that they can update them when the user does something. So here's my input, and I say bind : value. Value is the property of the input that I want to change, and so it will display what's currently in the name, and as I type, it will update that bit of state, which will cause this to re-render. For a checkbox, I want to bind to the checked property instead of value. If I want to have a set of checkboxes, I use bind group, and that's going to make favorite flavors be an array, and as I check the different checkboxes, those values will be added to the array. For radio buttons, I also use bind group, but of course the value is just going to be a single string in that case because I can only pick one of them. For a select, I can bind to the value. And here I'm iterating through all the colors and creating options for them. I have this one option with nothing in it so that you can have it be in a state where nothing is selected. If I wanted to allow multiple selections and have this be a scrollable list instead of a drop-down, all I have to do is add the multiple attribute, and then in that case the value I get is going to be an array of all the options that you've selected. And then text area, it's just like a text input. You bind to the value and there's the story, and so everything updates when you change those form elements. It's really easy to add animations, and this came about because Rich Harris, working at the different newspapers, really needed to have animations for the website for different news stories, and so he cares a lot about animation, and so all of these things are built in. And so here's just a really simple example. I would like it to be when I'm using my to-do app and I add a new to-do, it would be cool if it could sort of fade into view and not just appear in an abrupt way. And if I delete it, it would be nice if it could just fade out. But it's so easy to do that. All I have to do is pull in fade and then tell my list item that it should use that transition, and I'm done. So the other animations are similarly easy to use. So let me show an example of this. So here is my to-do application, and it has exactly that code. And so I'm going to add a new to-do here. And so watch when I add it, how that row is going to fade into view. Okay, so it wasn't really abrupt. And when I delete it, it's going to fade out. Okay? Nice to be able to get that effect with really just an import in one little bit on the list item. So there are some outstanding issues in Svelte, and I would say that the biggest one is that it does not yet have support for TypeScript. It is itself implemented in TypeScript, but you can't use TypeScript inside a .svelte file. Now, if you want any function you've defined there, you could define it in a .ts file instead, and then import it into your Svelte file. And then over in the TS file, you could use TypeScript. So they are working on this. There's the GitHub issue for it. I can't really predict how soon it will be, but I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year they have this worked out. So for some people, especially people used to working in Angular, this might be a deal breaker for them, and they might want to wait to use Svelte until it actually has TypeScript support. Another issue is just popularity. Popularity is a tough thing, right? If you are an Angular person, you have Google backing your tool and you're somewhat confident they're going to support that for a long time. With React, you've got Facebook backing it. Vue really bucked that trend and became pretty popular despite not having a big company behind it. And I hope that that will be the case for Svelte as well. That's yet to be seen. But I like to think that currently Svelte is the #4 framework in this category. And one reason to worry about such things is that it's not easy to find somebody that already knows Svelte. However, it's very easy to learn, and so that shouldn't be much of a hindrance. In fact, if I could talk to you for 2 hours instead of 1 hour, I think I would run out of things to say, and I would have already told you everything you could want to know about Svelte. I could not teach you everything you need to know about React or Vue or Angular in 2 hours. So that's why I think finding people that already know it, not such a big deal. So if you want to give this a try, there are 2 ways to get started. In either case, you need to install Node.js first. And then when you do that, you're going to get a bunch of commands, node and npm, but also this newer thing, npx. And Rich Harris created this thing called dget. And essentially all it's doing is making it easy for you to pull down the master branch of a given repo. And so if you execute this command, npx dget svelte.js/template, svelte.js is a username and template is the repo, and then you tell it what do you want to call your new app, it pulls down all this starter code for you, and you're ready to go. Another approach is to go to the Svelte REPL, and let me show you what that looks like. Okay. All right, so in the Svelte REPL, I can create a bunch of Svelte files and I can type in all my code and I can test it out right in the browser. I don't need to download anything, so it's great for playing around. And it's starting you off with this Hello World app, and it just displays Hello World. But there's a magic button here, right there. It's a download button. If I change the code, or even if I don't, if I click that, it's going to download a zip file with everything I need, and that's the starter for my project. So those are the 2 ways to get started with this. Once you've got your project, you cd to the directory for your app, you run npm install, and then npm run dev. You can also say npm run start. The difference between them is with the dev, it gives you live reload so that when you make changes to the code, it's recompiling it, building a new bundle, and then loading it in the browser. And that seems to be very fast. I don't notice any difference between Svelte and the other frameworks, despite the fact that it's having to compile the whole thing. And by default, it's listening on port 5000, and the default app you get just renders Hello World. So there's a lot of topics I didn't cover that I would cover in the second hour of the talk if I had one. So this is what you might want to look through on your own. There's a way that you could have a string of HTML and render that in a component. There's support for slots. So a component can have child elements, and I want to pass those to the component so it can decide whether it wants to render them or how many times to render them. We haven't talked a lot about event handling details, so there's a bit more to learn about that, especially modifiers that you can add that affect how the events are handled, and more about dispatching custom events. We haven't really talked about lifecycle events much, but like the other frameworks, you can have code that runs when your component is mounted And destroy, that's like being unmounted. Whenever there are changes being made, like you're getting new props passed in, there's before the update and after the update. We haven't talked about actions. That's something you can attach to a particular element in your HTML to say, when this element gets added to the DOM, here's a function that I want you to execute. And an example of that would be I could add an action to an input, and the function would move focus into that input. Module context is a way that you can say, I have some code that I want to run for this component, but I don't want to run it for every instance. I just want to run it for the component as a whole. It's like a class level sort of a thing. There are a bunch of special elements in Svelte that all start with Svelte:. You might want to look into those. If I say @debug inside curly braces, it means I'd like to break in my browser debugger anytime there's a state change in this component so that I can look at things. And I can even give a list after debug inside the curly braces to say, only break if these certain pieces of state change. You can write unit tests for your Svelte components, and you can do it using Jest, and there's a library called Svelte Testing Library that works in conjunction with Jest. That's the way I recommend doing it. You can write end-to-end tests using Cypress. You can compile to custom elements. So the previous talk in this room was about how you could create custom elements that you could use in other frameworks, and you can do that with Svelte by compiling to a custom element. There are some related tools you might want to check out, especially if you're a user of VS Code. You'll want to check out the Svelte extension for VS Code. Gives you syntax highlighting and IntelliSense. Another big topic is Sapper. So apparently a sapper is a person that clears out trees and builds roads so that people can get to a thing to work on it, something like that. And so Sapper is trying to make it easier for you to make use of Svelte. So it's kind of like Next and Gatsby. It gives you routing, it gives you server-side rendering, and some code splitting. Then there's Svelte Native if you want to write mobile apps. This is based on native script view. It's a community-driven project. I don't expect that it's all that mature just yet. Probably not yet a competitor to React Native, but at least it's moving in that direction. I mentioned the Svelte testing library. And then Storybook is an interesting tool that you can use for demoing your components to people. Sometimes it's the case that in a web app, a particular component, in order to see it on the screen, you've got to navigate through a bunch of things to get to it. Like you've got to log in, you've got to click this in the left nav, you have to select this option, and then a dialog box opens and it shows you this one component. So if there's a bug in that component and you're trying to fix it, going through all that navigation every time you've made a change is really tedious. But if you put all your components into Storybook, you have a left nav that has the names of all your components, and you just click it and you go right to that component. So it's great for showing people what the components look like working with a designer and having them approve or give you suggestions, and great for debugging. And so that works with Svelte and all the other major frameworks. So here's some resources for you to check out. The YouTube talk at the top, that's Rich Harris giving an excellent talk and explaining why he thinks using a virtual DOM is not such a good idea and why he doesn't do that in Svelte. But then there's a bunch of pages directly on the Svelte website, API docs and so on. There's the REPL that I showed you. There's a Discord chat room. A really cool thing happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I posted a video of me giving a similar talk as this in that chat room, and within about an hour, Rich Harris chatted and gave me some suggestions. He actually took the time to watch the entire video and gave me feedback. So really cool place to get information about Svelte. And then, of course, it's GitHub repo. So my conclusion is I think Svelte is really a worthy competitor to all the other frameworks. And if you'd like more detail, I wrote a really long article about Svelte. I think it's about 35 pages long. And all the things I said I didn't have time to talk about, they're all covered in that article, including examples of how to write tests. And so if you go out to that URL, you'll find that. And with that said, let me go back to the first slide and tell you something I forgot to say. And that is that you can email me anytime you want, ask me questions about this. And even more importantly, this URL is where I have slides for all of my talks. So if you go here, there's a directory called React and Vue and Svelte. There are 3 versions of Svelte talks out there, and they're labeled long, medium, and short. And you just saw the medium version of the talk. So we've got some time for questions. Any questions? Yes?
Is there a specific feature in TypeScript that made TypeScript a choice, or was it just a language preference of the author?
Are you talking about why did they implement it in TypeScript?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they just really wanted the type safety. They wanted to know that if they were breaking something, that the types would tell them that they did something wrong. I think it's really the same reason why Angular developers like using it. Yeah, I think that's all there is to it. I'm sure that if they never added TypeScript support to Svelte to let you use it, that there would be people that really aren't bothered by that. But then there's a set of people that would never even give it a look if they don't add that. So I think they're kind of forced to add that support at some point. Yes?
You mentioned that there's, you have the scope CSS and the individual component files, and then you have the global CSS. Is there a way to introduce CSS pre-processing or post-processing to that?
Yes, yes, you can do that. And if you look at my article, it shows exactly how to do that with adding Sass, but adding other preprocessors are really similar. Other questions? Yes?
So there's not like a CLI compile or something, it's just use rollup or something with a loader or something?
Yeah, it just automatically happens. Well, I should say, if you want to do it manually, you do npm run build, and it creates it for you. But when you're in development mode and you say npm run dev, it's doing that compiling automatically when it sees that you've changed a file. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you find the issues when you get to kind of larger applications with some syntax of the mustache kind of large stuff in your HTML? Does it get kind of bloated and stuff like that? Or?
Are you, so the question is, are there issues in a larger application using the mustache-like syntax? So maybe you're thinking about cases where you end up having nested ifs and that. So I don't think there's any confusion in the syntax about the nesting. But I can't claim to have experience developing a large Svelte app. I honestly haven't done that yet. I don't see any apparent issues, but yeah, I guess I can't answer that definitively. Yes?
Have you seen any good articles or anything about like benchmarks against React and Angular beyond like file size, but like performance?
I have seen some of that. Initially, I was, so the question is, have I seen any articles talking about performance comparisons to other frameworks? So when I was first investigating Svelte and writing an article about it, I really wanted to say not only is the bundle size smaller, but the performance is much better. And I saw many references that said that the performance was better, but every time I found a site that actually had numbers, that was not true. The performance was really similar to the other frameworks, but not necessarily better. So today I wouldn't pick Svelte because I'm looking for a performance gain, just that I want the initial load to be much faster. Any other questions? Yes?
So when you have like the reassigning references to in order to figure out remember for the array, so like maybe this is similar to the question earlier about we have that array, then having something for each element in that array gets fed to child components. Does it just know like, well, there was only one thing that actually got updated in this array, or then you know, we render all children but most get passed?
Right. So the question is, if I'm iterating through the elements in an array and rendering a component for each of those elements, and I make a change to the array, will it re-render all of those children or just the ones that have changed? And the answer is that it will only re-render the ones that have changed. And it'll know that because it's the reactive part means that it is very much looking to see changes and deciding based on that what it needs to re-render. So just the things that have changed.
So is it like looking at the data then, or?
Yeah, so the generated code, if you look at the generated code, you can see that it is explicitly doing dirty checking on those things and keeping track of the previous value and comparing it. Yeah, you could see that directly in the generated code that it does that for you. All right, we need to clear out for the next speaker, but thank you very much for attending.